Do violent video games actually promote real-life violence? This question has been discussed and researched several times on various occasions. Such topics usually come under discussion after a random act of mass killing. Recently, we witnessed two gruesome acts of the mass shooting in El Paso and Dayton, resulting in the deaths of 31 people with dozens left injured. Like the past, such incidents always compel us to think the primary reason for such acts of violence. President Donald Trump came forward and expressed his views related to the incident that raised some eyebrows. Trump, in a bold statement, blamed gruesome and grizzly video games that are now commonplace. This is not the first time video games have been named as the cause for promoting violence and leading to aggressive behaviors. To support this claim, several kinds of research have also been conducted with a goal to find a link between violence and video games. However, researchers have been conducting studies to find out the real truth for decades now. So far, mixed reviews have been received by researchers. We shall try to find out whether video games promote violence or are there much crucial factors behind it. Let's elaborate on all these questions in the light of recent researches and findings. One of the most detailed and extensive studies on the topic under discussion was conducted and published recently by University of Oxford. The study revealed no proof that playing violent video games lead to aggression in pubescent. A keen analysis of both objective and subjective data were used to estimate the violence and aggression in teenagers. The data comprised of information extracted directly from teenagers combined with the self-reported views from parents and caretakers to measure the level of violent behaviors and aggression in their children. The total subjects that took part in the study consisting of 14 to 15 years old British teens along with their parents and caretakers. The research finally concluded that no connection has been revealed between playing violent video games and real-world violence among teenagers. Another similar research by the American Psychological Association (APA) in 2015 found out that although violent video games are linked to aggression, yet there is not sufficient evidence to suggest that this aggression is related to criminal violence or felony. However, this research was heavily criticized and rejected by many scholars around the globe who believed that no credible evidence proves that violent video games promote aggressive behaviors. A group within the organization itself stepped up to debunk the claim by APA. In 2017, the Media Psychology and Technology Division of the APA came forward to correct the past mistake by publishing its latest findings that suggested that insufficient evidence is available that forms even the weakest link between playing violent video games and committing violent acts. The researchers provided the following arguments to support their statement. No solid evidence proves that the rapidly increasing sale of video games promote or support violent crimes. Even if such a connection existed, then we should have seen a rise in violent video games as a large number of people enjoy such games. But this is not the case. Some evidence suggests that nowadays, youth is more reverting toward video games, and despite that, the accounts of youth violence are decreasing. Suspected government intrusion and biased publications towards the topic under discussion have kept the audience from the truth. Studies that prove that violent video games are related to violence stands a better chance to get published than researches that prove otherwise. Therefore, a large sum of such researches is diverted from the facts and hold faulty conclusions. A recent report by FBI states that the crime rate has dropped to half to what it was back in the early 1990s. Now, what is worth wondering is that gaming is among the fastest rising trends in America that have been almost become a part of the culture. Nearly 75% of all households in America have one gamer at least. Now, if gaming would have even a slight connection with violence, then the crime rates would have been constantly rising, but the report by FBI proves otherwise. It means till now no irrefutable evidence is available by any research to conclude that video games are the cause of mass shootings, violence and crimes. Now, a controversial but highly vital question raises that why we were led to believe that video games cause violence. We have seen in the past that some politicians use video games as a scapegoat to clarify their position in case of any mass shootings or massacres at schools. It is a common tactic that they use to counter the allegations of failing to stop the ongoing violence in society. As a result, we have seen the state governments replacing the violent video games with a more appropriate collection, as we saw after 2012 Sandy Hook shooting in Newtown. The investigators allegedly found violent video games on the computers of mass murderers, so they blame video games since they are easy to target. A similar approach was adopted by US President Donald Trump while commenting on the El Paso and Dayton shooting in August 2019. Trump had complained about violent and gruesome video games when accounted for the incident. Consequently, Walmart announced to remove all such violent video games from its stores. However, President Trump seems to be unaware of the fact that although the US is not the top consumer of violent video games, still has one of the highest gun-related deaths rate in the world. What our politicians seem to miss is the fact that no research or study has provided any solid and irrefutable evidence that would suggest violent video games as a reason for crimes and violence in society. In fact, an economist, Michael Arwad from the University of Texas, concluded that high sale of violent games has been interlinked to a drop in crimes and violence. If we are looking for a connection, then this should be enough to convince us of the non-violent effects of video games. Another research shows that while over 70% of high school students play violent video games, only 20% of school shooters have reported playing these games. A group of researchers analyzed the habits and hobbies of 41 school attackers and concluded that only 5 of them enjoyed playing violent video games. Video games are among the rapidly increasing global business. Action and violent video games are also sold all over the world. Every year, a new part of the famous game Call of Duty is released, which is sold extensively in various countries around the globe. Despite that, only the United States seems to be the only country affected by it. On the other hand, countries like South Korea and Japan have a higher consumption of video games, but they seem to be unaffected by such violence. This is enough for us to believe that we can't blame violent video games for our negligence. We need to realize the graveness of such situations and seek out the roots of violence and crime among the teenagers and adults instead of blaming it all on the video games. However, let's not get distracted from this excuse, as politicians have long been using this trick and getting away with it. This leaves us with another question, that if video games are not the cause of mass shootings, then what's the reason? The cause of homicide and mass shootings involve not one but many factors. These reasons are crucial to explore so that we can take countermeasures to avoid such acts of violence in the future. President Trump's allegations against violence in video games is least to be considered, since we have no such evidence that video games, violent or not, and violence are related. One solid reason to consider is the easy availability of firearms that could contribute to homicide and mass shootings. However, firearms alone are not the reason. They are of course a mere means of committing violence, as we've seen the rise in knife attacks in the UK. Let us explore some more options that could provide us the answers we seek. We can raise the argument that mass shootings and similar acts of violence have something to do with the mental health of the perpetrator. Obviously, one in a normal mental condition normally could not think of killing innocents in such a gruesome manner. Alone in 2016, the US witnessed 1,415 homicides related to guns. Moreover, 90% of all people who committed suicide in the same year suffered from depression. Although there is no universal cause for mass shootings, however, disturbed mental health could be one of the leading causes. However, it does not mean that every person with mental health conditions is at the verge of committing violent acts, since those suffering from such conditions are more likely to commit suicide instead of homicide. Researchers revealed that some mass shooters have suffered from mental illnesses such as psychosis and schizophrenia. However, many shooters seem not to have a history of such conditions. Some other factors that could determine the probability of someone to become a mass shooter include narcissism, wish for infamy, history of domestic violence, and interest in other shooters. Another prominent subjective reason for homicides could be hatred. Trump too, while expressing his views on recent shootings, mentioned hatred as a part leading to these incidents. Hatred and extremist views might be influencing some shooters to commit mass shootings. In this regard, those suffering from mental health conditions might at greater risk of committing acts of violence fueled by hatred. A prominent reason for this can be reflected in the light of recent shootings of El Paso and Dayton. The shooter responsible for El Paso expressed his views in the form of hate against the immigrants in the manifesto he wrote. Meanwhile, the Dayton shooter had expressed leftist and anti-fascism views. Each shooter had hatred against something that motivated them to commit such a gruesome act. Fear is another factor that could pull the trigger. Just as depicted by the views of shooters from recent shootings, they were concerned by their reputation and safety. People might be afraid of what foreigners might do to their culture, jobs, lands, and safety. Although President Trump has adopted a very strict policy on immigration, the fact is, The US constitutes only 5% of the world population but is responsible for 30% of all mass shootings in the world. People afraid to lose their jobs or feeling getting their privacy invaded might act violent sometimes, especially those suffering from some type of mental conditions. Thus, blaming video games divert our attention from much broader and graver issues at hand. Millions of video games were developed, sold and played by players globally every year. Millions of people enjoy playing violent video games, but that does not inspire them to repeat the on-screen action in the real world as well. If violent video games caused violence and mass shootings, then there would have been a homicide in almost every town in each country. However, this is not the case. As of now, there is no statistical connection between violent video games and mass shootings. There could not be only one reason for violence that has been happening recently. However, special care must be given to those suffering from mental diseases for a chance to avoid similar mishaps in the future, either in the form of suicide or homicide. More study and researches are to be followed until we can grasp the roots of the evils in our society.